Hey everybody, I have a fun gel press video for you today. I want to bring back a postcard tradition. So these are some really fun monochromatic postcards with the gel press, just using one color of paint and some super simple texture tools that you might have laying around. I'm starting by stamping the word postcard onto my little postcards, which are actually just card fronts that are slightly smaller than an A2 card. They are 4 by 5 1/4. And I love this sort of old-fashioned postcard stamp. When I was in college in the late 1900s, my friends and I sent each other postcards everywhere we went. We mailed postcards. We did mail art. We stamped on our envelopes and drew on our envelopes and did all sorts of things. So I thought maybe I would revive that by making some beautiful printed postcards. Now, when you choose the ink for the back side of your postcard, just make sure that it's something that is waterproof in case that gets wet when it goes through the mail. I'm using Gina K Amalgam ink here. And the acrylic paint that I'm going to use for the back of the postcard is already going to be waterproof. So you don't have to worry about your postcard going through the mail. One tip though, gel pens are not waterproof. I do have a video on watercoloring with gel pens, and I made that video because I found out with a ruined piece of mail that they're not waterproof. So write with something permanent when you're writing out the address. So I have masked the edges of these all off with artist tape just to kind of get a clean border. You could also just print all the way to the edge of your cards. Since they're smaller than my 5x7 gel press, that is an option too. But I like the way that clean border looks. So I'm using Golden Open acrylics here, and I'm going to be using several different techniques for layering this single color of paint. To get a little texture, I have a wadded up piece of copy paper. This is one of my favorite sort of abstract texture tools. And I'm going to add a little darker spot of paint to part of the gel press, leaving the texture from the copy paper, but then varying the tonal value of this paint. That's what gives the monochromatic postcards a really cool look, is just varying that paint. So I picked up through the Punchinella some dark dots, and I'll layer lighter paint on top of those. And then that also gave me the texture from the Punchinella on the plate that I will use on this postcard. So you'll just want to really make sure you're rubbing near the edges of the tape when you go to print these so that you don't get a little halo, and instead you get a really crisp straight line where that tape is on the postcard. I'm using my favorite artist tape, which comes in a few different sizes. So you can see how much variation I get on this first postcard, from the fun wadded up paper texture in the background to the darker paint versus the lighter paint on that layer, and then the Punchinella with a little bit of the pattern lifted out. And it looks like I've done 3 or 4 different things to this postcard, but it's just a single pull print. Very fun. And then the little postcard stamp on the back. Now there's lots left on the plate. You can feel free to pick this up to start off a second postcard if you want. I will be doing that later on, but I'm just going to proceed and add a little bit more paint. The longer you brayer, the more you will remove paint from the plate, and that can allow you to get the contrast between lighter and darker colors. So now I'm using my silicone spatula to just freeform some little rounded patterns into the paint that's on the plate. I've intentionally left it darker at the top and lighter at the bottom. Again, it's that easy variation that makes these prints so interesting. And because they're abstract, you don't have to worry that you're stamping them upside down opposite your stamped postcard greeting. So that's nice too. Now, this is the one where I picked up the dots through the Punchinella to begin with because I knew that would be a darker element on this postcard, and you can see what a difference that makes. So I have lights, mediums, and darks all on the same print with lots of interest and texture in the background. So here I'm going to do the picking up part of what's left on the plate. That will be a background element for the next print. And a lot of times you'll have different interesting structures. At the end, I'll show you picking up the mark that the taped off card leaves on the plate can give a really fun structure to your prints. So now I'll try something a little more organic. I'm going to add these feathers to get kind of a softer texture in the background. And that does two things. It lifts light spots up out of the background, but it also adds this fun organic texture that you'll see on the finished postcard. Punchinella is great just to add a little bit of paint through, and this will give me my dark. I tried on each one of these to make sure that there was a much darker section of each one of these little prints. And so just putting a little bit of paint directly through that stencil and moving it around with the silicone spatula will give me that deep dark that I'm looking for to contrast with some of the other areas. So now I will print this little guy that I picked up a partial print from leftover paint on the plate, and that will just get incorporated into the design. Now, if you are going to do this with Golden Open acrylics, just remember they need a lot of drying time. Don't stack them on top of each other because that open medium in them just means that they will stay wet longer. So here you can see those fun lines. You can see the feather texture, the Punchinella. It has so much going on and it just looks like a really arty print. The little feathers are such a fun detail in the background. You'll be able to see close-ups of these that I created during this session at the end. But I love the way this looks, and I think the darker paint through the Punchinella gives it a very 3D look, and then there's just the hint of those feathers in the background. So here's what these are starting to look like. It's a very fun little stack. And on the next one, I'll do the same thing, pick up the print, and you can see what I'm talking about with the tape. That's just the tape making an impression on the paint that's left on there. And that gives you these fun, strong, diagonal and straight lines on the postcard. You really don't need very much paint on the plate when you're doing these. Again, you want the variation between light and dark. So if you start with just a small amount of paint, you're guaranteed just to get a lighter layer that I can then go over one of these partially printed postcards with. And those patterns that I picked up off the plate will show through really well if that paint layer is very light and thin. Golden Open has the transparencies marked on the paint tubes, and I find that a transparent paint is better for this technique than an opaque paint because I can do this. I can print these light layers on top of marks that were already made on the postcard. And you can see all of them through that translucent top layer. And I just find that really, really fun. Now make sure your tape goes all the way to the edge of your postcard so you don't pick up a tiny blue line. I did that on a couple of these, and I also didn't clean my hands that well, so I did get a little bit of paint on there. But it is a homemade postcard, and so nobody needs to worry about it being perfect. That is for sure. So this last one, if you want to, you can draw a straight line down the middle of your postcard. I don't do that, but feel free. In the postcard stamp set that I'm using, I will put down below. It has lots of different fonts in this stamp set, so you don't have to choose the one that I chose. Now I have a very lacy, fun little stencil. And then I'm just going to put some paint through this little spiral. I like these little marks. I felt like I could have some dark marks on the plate that would contrast with this lighter layer because that lacy stencil did lift quite a bit of paint as it was creating the pattern. And so that's kind of fun to contrast that with the darker little spiral. Now you can also just lift some paint through a stencil or the Punchinella in my case, and then just position your card over the patterns that you want to pick up. I wanted to make sure that I got that little spiral, but lots and lots of that lacy texture because it's really very different from the other patterns that I've put down so far, and I thought it was really fun. So there you can see the contrast between light and dark. I really think that's the secret to the interest in these postcards, is just making sure you have one or two areas of super dark, medium, and light tones on them, and you'll see how different they all are. It's amazing what you can do with one color of paint and the gel press, so I encourage you to experiment with monochromatic techniques. I have several videos on this channel with monochromatic printing techniques, and so I hope you'll take a look at those because I do always enjoy challenging myself to work with just one color. So here's one of the finished postcards. Almost looks like little fish. I love it. Thanks so much for watching.